Max Greer sat hunched over his desk, his tired eyes blinking against the dim light of his computer monitor. The screen flickered, its pale glow illuminating the cluttered room that served as both his apartment and his workshop. An empty pizza box rested beside an overflowing trash can, a half-empty bottle of soda left forgotten on the floor. The room smelled faintly of stale caffeine and the lingering scent of grease. Max had been at it for hours, no, days now. He lost track of time. The work was familiar, but today it felt different. He scratched at his scruffy beard, a nervous habit he'd picked up over the years. He was a hacker, a wizard in a digital realm, but recently, his work had become monotonous. Government files? Check. Corporate security breaches? Easy. The thrill of cracking systems and unveiling secrets had lost its edge, until now, Max had stumbled upon something new, something different, something that made his fingers itch with curiosity. The Genesis Code, as it was being called in the underground hacker forums. The name alone was enough to pique his interest. He'd heard rumors of it, vague, half-baked theories about a program that could reset reality itself, rewrite history, and manipulate dimensions. Max had never been one to believe in conspiracy theories, but after days of searching, he'd finally cracked the encryption and found the key. The Genesis Code was real, and it was sitting right in front of him. His fingers hesitated above the keys for a moment. He had to admit, it was tempting. The idea of unlocking a program that could bend reality to his will. It was almost too good to be true, but Max wasn't some gullible amateur. He knew how to tread carefully. He had to test it, see what it could do, and, most importantly, see if it was even real. After all, he could always shut it down if things got out of hand. Max leaned in closer, his breath shallow, and typed in the final command: access Genesis Code. The screen flickered again, and a strange prompt appeared. Warning: this code has the potential to rewrite the fabric of existence. Proceed with caution. Max stared at the message for a long moment. It wasn't what he had expected. No, this wasn't some obscure, cryptic string of numbers. This was something alive. A warning from the code itself? It sent a chill down his spine. I'm not some kid playing with fire, Max muttered under his breath. I know what I'm doing. He hit enter. Suddenly, the room seemed to warp. The edges of the screen blurred as lines of code scrolled faster than Max's mind could process. The program was alive now, responding to his every command, every touch. His heartbeat quickened. The code seemed to pulse, almost breathing, as though it were sending messages from some unseen dimension. Max didn't know what he was expecting, but it wasn't this. He stared at the screen in disbelief as the interface shifted, revealing strange patterns and symbols, unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Then, a new prompt appeared. Are you sure you want to reset everything? The consequences will be magnificent. Max blinked, then let out a nervous laugh. Reset everything? Yeah, right. Like that's going to happen. He was probably being pranked. A hacker's worst nightmare was being caught in a digital joke, and this one was especially elaborate, but something about it felt too real. He had never seen code like this. The symbols danced before his eyes, mocking his skepticism. What if this was real? What if he really could change the course of history? Max shook his head. No. He wasn't some idealist looking for a way to fix the world. This was just a program. Just a piece of code. He wasn't going to reset anything. With a swift movement, he closed the window, deciding it was time to shut down for the night. But just as his hand hovered over the power button, a voice, soft, almost seductive, echoed in his mind. It's not just the world you can change. It's everything. Every timeline. Every choice. Every version of you. Max froze. His breath caught in his throat. There was no way that had been in his head. The voice had come from the screen, from the program. And it sounded like it knew him. Max wasn't afraid of the unknown. In fact, it was what drew him to hacking in the first place, the thrill of unearthing secrets buried deep within systems. But this was different. This felt wrong. Okay, Max muttered to himself, you've got my attention. He hesitated for a moment longer, his hand trembling as it reached back toward the keyboard. He typed in a new line, curiosity bubbling beneath his calm exterior. What happens if I change something small? Just test it? The Genesis code didn't answer directly. Instead, the screen shimmered, and Max suddenly found himself standing in front of a mirror that wasn't in his apartment. His pulse raced. Where was he? The room around him was completely unfamiliar. The walls were painted a bright shade of blue, and the floor was covered with a thick carpet that felt plush beneath his feet. His reflection stared back at him, except it wasn't quite right. It wasn't his usual messy, tired face. No, the version of Max in the mirror looked pristine, like he hadn't seen a sleepless night in years. What the hell is this? Max whispered, his voice trembling. He looked around, and the surroundings seemed off. His heart began to race as he realized he wasn't at home anymore. He reached for his phone, but it wasn't there. Instead, he picked up a small device lying on a table. The screen lit up as soon as he touched it, revealing a contact list filled with names he didn't recognize. His breath caught in his throat. These people weren't just strangers, they were important figures, influential in ways he couldn't understand. Then, the room shifted. The mirror version of him disappeared, replaced by a darker, more cynical reflection. This version of Max was grinning, his eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. Max stepped back. This was no ordinary glitch. The Genesis code wasn't just altering his surroundings, it was reshaping him. His identity. His very life. In a panic, he reached for the keyboard and typed in the reset command, desperate to return to the world he knew. The screen flickered once more, and the mirror returned to its original form. He was back in his apartment, his real apartment, as far as he could tell. But the questions lingered in his mind. What was happening? Was this some kind of hallucination, or had he actually changed something, reality itself? Max sat back in his chair, the weight of what he had just done settling over him. I don't know if I can stop now, he muttered. The Genesis code was too powerful. And now, he couldn't just walk away. He was in too deep. The game had changed, and there was no going back. Max leaned back in his chair, his hands still trembling on the keyboard. The words reset everything echoed in his mind. He had done it. He had shifted something, maybe not the entire world, but enough to make him question what was real, what was possible. For the first time in a long while, Max felt something that wasn't boredom or indifference. He felt alive. The power to change everything was at his fingertips. It was a thrilling, intoxicating sensation. The idea of rewriting his life, the history of the world, or the very course of time itself seemed limitless, but the question that gnawed at him was simple: should he keep going? Should he test how far he could push this power before it broke something? Max's fingers hovered above the keyboard. He could reset the past. He could undo every mistake he'd ever made, every missed opportunity, every wrong turn. He could be rich. He could be famous. He could be anything. He could change his entire life in an instant. What would it be like to live in a world where every choice was perfect, where every regret could be erased? The possibility felt overwhelming, and the weight of it pressed down on his chest. But as much as the idea thrilled him, there was something else, something darker, lurking in the back of his mind. What if the Genesis code had consequences? What if, by changing one thing, everything else fell apart? Max had always prided himself on his ability to think a few steps ahead, to outsmart systems and break codes without breaking himself. But this was different. This was a line between curiosity and madness, a precipice from which there might be no return. He took a deep breath and typed out a command to close the Genesis code. The screen flickered, but the program didn't shut down. Instead, a new line of text appeared: "You can't undo what you've done. Once the code is in motion, it can never stop. Welcome to the true power of creation." Max's stomach twisted. The words sent a shiver down his spine, and his skin tingled with the cold weight of realization. This was no simple program, no mere glitch in the matrix. It was something far more complex, something far more dangerous. And there was no going back. The room seemed to shrink around him as the air grew thick with an oppressive sense of inevitability. Max rubbed his eyes, trying to steady himself. He was still in his apartment, still in Chicago, but the world felt different. As if the boundaries between his reality and something else, something more, were starting to blur. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his daze. It was a message from Sarah, his best friend. She was the one person in the world who could always keep him grounded, the one person who knew just how far his obsession with hacking could go. "Max, you still there? You've been quiet for hours. You okay?" He stared at the screen for a long moment. Sarah wasn't just a friend, she was also a brilliant AI researcher. Her perspective on the digital world was as sharp as his, but she always had a level of caution that he often lacked. He knew she wouldn't be happy about what he was playing with, but he couldn't resist. He had to talk to her about it. He needed her to understand, to see what he was seeing, even if she'd never believe him. "I've found something. It's real, Sarah. The Genesis code. I think I can rewrite reality." He hesitated before sending the message, as if doubting his own words. The last few hours had warped his sense of what was possible. What had he done to deserve such power? Was he even the same person anymore? Seconds later, Sarah replied. "What the hell are you talking about? What did you find, Max?" Max sighed and leaned back in his chair, staring at the glowing screen. He could feel the weight of the Genesis code pressing against him, urging him to explore it, to push further into the unknown. But he knew he had to tread carefully. He couldn't let anyone get too close to the truth, not yet. That he typed his response quickly, not wanting to leave too much time for doubt. "I'm serious. I've unlocked something that can reset everything. Every timeline. Every choice. It's a program that could rewrite the entire world. History, people, even the way we think. I don't know how far it goes, but I think I can change anything I want." The reply came almost instantly. "Max, I've warned you about this kind of thing. Playing God never ends well. You're tampering with something you don't understand. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Max stared at the screen. The words were exactly what he expected. He had been warned countless times before. Sarah knew him too well. But something inside of him resisted the urge to back down. He had come too far. He had unlocked the door to a new world, and there was no way he could simply close it now. "I don't need a lecture, Sarah. I've been careful. I'm testing it, just to see what it can do. If it's real, then maybe I can fix some things." He didn't expect a reply right away. Sarah had a habit of taking her time when she needed to think. But the truth was, Max wasn't really talking to Sarah anymore. He was talking to himself, convincing himself that this was the right thing to do. As the minutes passed, Max felt the weight of the code pressing down on him again. It was calling to him, urging him to change something. To make the world better. Or maybe just to make his life better. He could fix everything. He could be happy. He could fix all the things that had gone wrong. He opened his browser, staring at the search bar for a long moment before typing a question into the search engine: "What happens if you rewrite the past?" The answers that came back were a mix of philosophy, quantum mechanics, and speculation. There were theories about alternate realities and infinite timelines, about the consequences of changing a single event in history. Some said it could destroy everything. Others claimed it would create a new, better world. But none of them offered anything concrete. None of them could tell him what would really happen if he used the Genesis code to change the past. Max scrolled through the results, his mind spinning. There had to be an answer. There had to be a way to understand the full implications of what he was doing. He sighed and clicked on a link to a forum post from a hacker who claimed to have used a similar program. The post was filled with warnings about the dangers of tampering with the fabric of reality, about the way even small changes could have catastrophic consequences. But there was one line that stood out to Max: once you start changing things, you'll never know what you're actually changing. The code doesn't just change the past. It changes you, too. Max froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had never thought about it that way. Of course, changing the past would change things for everyone else, but what if it changed him? What if every change he made reshaped who he was? The screen flashed. Another prompt. What will you change? What will you become? Max swallowed hard. The weight of the question hung in the air like a threat. There was no going back now. His hand moved instinctively toward the keyboard. He typed one word: nothing. For a moment, nothing happened. The screen blinked. And then the room around him shifted, just slightly, like the air had been stirred. Max felt a sudden dizziness, a shift in his own perception, as if the reality he had known was slipping through his fingers. He blinked, trying to steady himself, but the world around him seemed off. The room looked the same, but there was a subtle difference. The shadows were darker, the light warmer. The quiet hum of the city outside his window sounded more distant. The air tasted different, too, thicker, somehow. Max rubbed his eyes, trying to focus. Then he realized something had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. Sarah was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She hadn't been here before. Not like this. How did I get here? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Max's heart stopped. He stared at her, unable to speak. Had he changed something without meaning to? Had he just altered reality? Max? Sarah's voice broke through his shock. What's going on? Where are we? Max couldn't answer. All he could do was stare at her, wide-eyed, as the full weight of his actions finally sank in. He hadn't just altered the world. He had altered himself. Max's breath caught in his throat, the words failing to leave his mouth as Sarah stood in the doorway, staring at him with confusion and disbelief. The room felt like it was spinning, the air heavy with the sound of his heart thumping wildly in his chest. How had she gotten here? Where was here, even? His apartment hadn't looked this way moments ago, had it? Or had it, Max? Sarah's voice broke through the disorienting fog swirling in his head. What's going on? Where are we? She looked around, her eyes darting to the cluttered room, the pizza boxes, the half-empty soda cans, the faint glow of the screen casting a strange light across the space. But it was the subtle differences, the dimming of the outside light, the distant hum of the city's sounds, that unnerved him. Everything felt off. Max finally managed to speak, though his voice sounded foreign, like someone else was using it. I don't know. His mind was a blur, his thoughts scrambled. It was like everything had shifted, but he hadn't done anything, at least, not intentionally. Had he made a change in reality? The Genesis code was supposed to give him control, but this felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Sarah stepped inside cautiously, her gaze never leaving him. Max, what's happening? You said you found something, but I did, he interrupted, his voice a little sharper than he intended. I found the Genesis code. Sarah tilted her head, clearly not understanding. The Genesis code? What is that? Some sort of hack? You're messing with things again, aren't you? Her eyes were wide now, the hint of concern edging into her voice. Max, you know better than this. This isn't just some file you're cracking. If you're trying to change things, if you've got some sort of power like that, She shook her head, cutting herself off, her face flushed with frustration. You don't understand what you're doing. I do understand, Max said, but even as he said it, a deep sense of doubt curled in his gut. I've been careful. I've only been testing it. Small things, nothing major. But something's wrong, Sarah. I don't know what happened, but I'm not sure I'm even the same person anymore. His eyes searched hers, looking for understanding, or maybe something to hold on to. What if I've already changed too much? Sarah's face softened, and she moved toward him, but there was a wariness in her steps, as though she wasn't sure what she'd find when she got closer. Max, listen to me. If you found some program that lets you reset the world, you need to get rid of it. No one can control that kind of power, not for long. Look, I know you, okay? You're brilliant, but you don't think through everything. You can't just, I didn't mean for this to happen, Max interrupted again, more forcefully this time, his frustration rising. I didn't know what I was doing, I swear. But now it's like the lines between what's real and what's not are fading. He gestured around the room, trying to explain the sensation, but the words didn't quite capture the feeling of strangeness, the creeping unease that seemed to grow with every breath. The world had shifted around him, as if the ground beneath his feet had given way, and he wasn't sure how far the fall would be. Max turned back to the computer screen, the Genesis code still open and glowing. The words on the screen were almost mocking, as though they knew they had control. They knew he was lost, knew he was tangled in something too deep to understand, let alone control. You can't undo what you've done. Max's fingers hovered above the keys again, the temptation to keep testing, to keep going, to push just a little further gnawing at him. Maybe he could fix this. Maybe he could make it right. But what if that was a lie? What if the more he played with this power, the less real everything became? Sarah, noticing his hesitation, stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. Max, stop. Please. She put a hand on his arm, grounding him with her touch. I'm scared for you. You need to shut it down, right now. The warmth of her hand on his skin was a fleeting comfort, but it wasn't enough to shake the weight pressing on him. He pulled his arm away, not harshly, but with the same sense of urgency that had started to creep into his veins. He had to fix this. He had to make the code work, fix whatever had gone wrong. I don't know how, he whispered. I don't know how to undo this. Sarah's gaze softened with pity, her eyes filled with concern. Max. You can't fix this. Not by yourself. You're playing with something that could break everything. Don't you understand that? The more you change, the more you lose yourself. You're already losing yourself, Max. He shook his head, not wanting to hear it. He couldn't be the person who ran from this. Not now. Not when the power was within his reach. He stood up abruptly, walking toward the window, his gaze fixed on the city below. The streets were alive with the hum of everyday life, people walking by, oblivious to the chaos he was teetering on the edge of. What if I could change things, he muttered to himself. What if I could fix everything? The wars, the hunger, the pain, what if it didn't have to be like this? Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. You're not God, Max. He turned, the words stinging, but they cut through the haze in his mind. Maybe I don't have to be, he said, his voice shaky. Maybe I just need to fix myself first. Before Sarah could respond, the screen flickered, and a new prompt appeared, this time much more personal. What will you change about yourself? What will you sacrifice? Max's stomach tightened. The question was more than just a prompt, it was an ultimatum. He felt it in his bones. The Genesis code wasn't asking him if he wanted to change things, it was demanding that he decide what he was willing to lose to gain everything else. Max stared at the words for what felt like an eternity. What would he change about himself? What would he be willing to give up to fix the world? To make everything right? He thought of the regrets in his life, the relationships he had ruined, the chances he had squandered, the mistakes that hung around his neck like weights. Could he erase them? Could he rewrite his past? He was losing control, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized, this wasn't just about fixing the world. It was about fixing himself. Maybe that was the real temptation. The desire to become someone better, someone who didn't have to carry the burden of failure, but there was a voice in the back of his mind, faint but insistent, telling him he was on the verge of making the biggest mistake of his life. He could feel it now, the presence of the Genesis code, pulling him, urging him to act. Max's hands trembled as they hovered over the keyboard. He thought of Sarah, of the world outside, of the life he had built, or the life he thought he had built. He couldn't go on like this, caught in the web of choices he wasn't sure he even understood, but before he could make a decision, before he could even begin to consider the consequences of his actions, the screen flashed once more, and the familiar warning appeared again. You can't stop this. It has already begun. Max's heart skipped a beat as the room seemed to warp around him. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. The world outside the window wasn't the same. The streets weren't the same. Everything felt different. The weight of the realization hit him like a wave. He hadn't just changed something small. He had changed everything. The past. The present. His own identity, and there was no going back.